Greetings and welcome. We are continuing our study going through the book of Second Peter and looking at some of the important ideas that are kept there for us by way of reminder. Just remember that this is Peter's, it's like his farewell address. He believes that his death is coming soon, and so he wants to leave the Christians that he loves a final message of encouragement and hope, but also of warning now and for the future. He wants to encourage them to grow and to excel in their faith, but at the same time, he wants to warn them because there are people who are going to come and who are going to try to knock you off the course that you were on. If you've ever done much hiking or anything like that, you'll know that sometimes when you're going through the woods, there are markers. So there are some hikes that say it's a green triangle, and you look for the green triangle on the trees, and that kind of keeps you going in the right direction. You walk for a while, then you haven't seen one, and you're thinking, I don't know if I made a wrong turn, and you go a little further, but whenever you see it, you go, okay, great, I know I'm on the right track. It's a helpful thing. Um, I think that's what Peter wants this book to be. I think he wants it to be that green triangle that lets you know you're on the right track. So stick with it. Don't give up on it. The apostles aren't going to be around forever. Peter sees his death as imminent. What's the church going to look like when the people who actually knew and talked to and learned from Jesus, who actually saw the great works from his hands, who actually saw things like the transfiguration, which Peter mentions in this very book, what's the church going to look like when they're all gone? How is the church going to know that it's on the right path? Well, books like this are those green triangles along the hike that let you know you're going the right way. There will be moments of confusion. There will be times where you're not certain if you're doing things right, but you go back and you look for the marker. So Second Peter, I think, is intended to be a marker for the church now and into the future. And it's supposed to give us relief that when we read it and we say, okay, we're on the right track still. We're going the way we need to do. We're still honoring Christ. And so he encourages the church to grow, but he also says there are people who are going to be standing along the trail saying, come this way. There's a beautiful view over here. You won't miss the trail. It's okay to get off for a little bit. And all of a sudden you end up lost and wandering in the wilderness, no idea where the destination is anymore. There are false teachers who come, and it sounds like they have great ideas and a great message, but ultimately those are the things that will get you lost. Those are the things that will lead to destruction. Those are the things that get you off the path. And so chapter 2 is where Peter is really kind of, it's his most explicit look at who these false teachers are, and he does not paint a flattering picture of them. He speaks about them in such ways that it becomes very obvious by looking for certain clues who these people are. If you look at chapter 3, he basically gets into arguing against some of the things that they say, and it seems like one of the things they're doing is denying the coming of the Lord. And if you deny the coming of the Lord, then it doesn't much matter how you live in the here and now. And so one of the things that you'll see is they kind of live for themselves. They live very selfish lives. That's a way of indicating a false teacher, whether or not they're using the gospel for their own selfish means or whether or not they're actually teaching for the betterment of other people, if they're making sacrifices for other people, if they actually care about other people. And so selfishness is one of the key features that will be consistent throughout his unpleasant description of the false teachers. Last week we looked at the first 10 verses or so of 2 Peter chapter 2, and we kind of compared and contrasted 2 Peter in 2 and 3 and the book of Jude. And we saw a ton of links and echoes and connections between those two sections. We also noticed a couple of the differences in those sections. But we noticed that both of them rely heavily on the Old Testament, and they rely heavily on teaching about angels and things like that. They both reference the fact that the false teachers are reviling angelic majesties or angelic authorities, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. But we've seen kind of some connections between the Old Testament, Jude, and this section of 2 Peter 2 that we're reading right here. Just to kind of briefly recap a few things, if you're looking for clues that the person who's teaching you or talking to you is one of these false teachers, you're not usually going to be able to find it in how they're dressed. You're not going to be able to find it in what they look like. You can't look at a false teacher and immediately identify them as a false teacher. Jesus describes it in Matthew chapter 7 as they're like wolves in sheep's clothing. When you look at them, they are very well disguised. They look just like a sheep, just like all the other sheep. They're not over there with a mischievous grin, or they're not over there, like, I don't know, covered in whatever you think they shouldn't be covered in. Like, they look like good people just like anyone else. They look like trustworthy people, and they actually say things that sound good. They're not just blathering idiots. They're often very good communicators. They can speak in such a way where you say, that's a little different, but that sounds interesting. That's intriguing, and you want to go a little bit further, go a little further, and go a little bit further, until you end up somewhere you never thought you'd be, in your beliefs and in your practices and in your actual actions. One of the things I think about false teaching is that it doesn't usually just impact your theology, doesn't just impact your mind and your personal beliefs, but those impact you as a person. They change you. They change what you do. They change how you treat people. And so Peter wants them to be very cautious. I don't think you should go around assuming everyone's a false teacher, and I don't think you should go around every time you hear something a little different, meet it with skepticism or meet it with distrust. But certainly be very careful and always have discernment when you're listening to people teach, and look for certain clues. Second Peter chapter 2 and verse 1 says that these people bring in, secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the master. All right, that's a telltale sign. If you are listening to someone teach and all of a sudden Jesus is being de-emphasized, that should send up alarm bells very loudly, that what you're hearing is probably something dangerous. If you keep going down the road that this teacher's leading you down, he might bring you farther and farther away from Jesus. When Jesus's teachings are kind of relegated to, these are things, they're impossible to actually put into practice, so you don't actually try to do these things, but just learn from it, maybe recognize how sinful you are, or something like that. Or if the actual person of Jesus, he was a great prophet, a mighty guy, but there have been a lot of great and mighty prophets. If you ever hear someone in such a way bringing other people to the level of Jesus, that's a warning. That's something you should be very cautious about. If people de-emphasize Jesus and emphasize you more, or emphasize other people, things like, Jesus isn't so much the key to salvation, but are you a good person? Do you help people? Are you kind? Are you generous? And all of a sudden, salvation becomes more about you being great rather than Jesus being great. That type of stuff is a denial of Jesus. You're getting on very dangerous territory when you de-emphasize his teaching and his life, when you de-emphasize his superiority over anyone and everyone else, and when you de-emphasize that he is our means of salvation. You gotta be very careful with that type of stuff. That's a warning. If you hear that type of talking, false teaching is probably already begun. Secondly, in verse 2, he says, many will follow their sensuality, and because of them, the way of truth will be maligned. Uh, One of the ways of knowing that you're dealing with a false teacher is the way that their sexual purity manifests itself, or lack thereof. I mean, you don't have to watch the news very much to know that there are a lot of people who, in the name of religion, get authority, and they use that to gratify themselves sexually, or to take advantage of people, to take advantage of people in the church, to take advantage of women or others. And you end up seeing that that's a misuse of, they might, by the way, everything they're saying might even be true. They might not speak false things about the Bible. But if they're even teaching truth in such a way to take advantage of people, or to get authority, or to get respect, and then to act in impure ways, that's what a false teacher is. False teaching isn't being mistaken. False teaching isn't saying something and even being wrong. I mean, I'm certain that I'm wrong about things, but I don't think I'm a false teacher. Everyone's wrong about something. You just don't know what it is. If you knew what it was, you'd probably change it. That's a good sign of being someone who cares about truth. But false teaching is less about getting something wrong and more about intentionally deceiving people for selfish means, or denying the master, or even teaching for the wrong motives. teaching truth so that everyone will respect you and go to you for counsel, and then you can prey upon people or take advantage of people. False teachers are those who take advantage of people sensually, and that's a good sign that the person you're dealing with is not doing this for the right reasons, but is doing it for the wrong reasons, um, or in their teaching. And I think this is important in someone's teaching. With regards to sensuality, if they start opening up the door to new possibilities of things that have never been part of Christianity or Christian ethics or morals before, but all of a sudden they have new ideas and new interpretations that loose you from the bonds of strict sexual repression or something like that, and they start opening up the door to all kinds of new things. I think Peter sees that as a warning sign that the person you're dealing with is probably more interested in gratifying the flesh than they are actually being true to the teachings of Jesus and actually being a true teacher. Verse 3, he moves on from sexuality and he mentions greed. And in their greed, they exploit you with false words. I think when you have people, even if everything they say is true, if they say it because they care more about money than the kingdom, guess what? You've got yourself a false teacher. That's a warning sign. When people care more about getting your money than they care about you, that's a warning sign that you have a false teacher. If people's teaching begins to revolve around money and how we can get more of it and how we can have excess and comfort and all that, then you are probably dealing with someone who is teaching with impure motives. And that's more in line with the way Bible talks about false teachers. Jesus says you will know them by their fruits. That's an interesting way of determining false teachers. He says you'll know them by their fruits. In the Old Testament, there's a relatively simple way of determining whether or not someone was a false prophet. Say they prophesy something and then it doesn't happen. Well, there you go. That's your evidence. They're a false prophet right there. You're not supposed to listen to that person. Or if someone is a false prophet and they're telling you to worship other gods, there's actually very serious punishment and penalty for that one. Some false prophets you just don't listen to because they're false. Some of them actually lead you astray to paganism or to worship other gods or to idols, and they are to be punished. Capital punished. That's a capital crime in the law of Moses. And so there were some ways of determining whether or not someone was a true or false prophet, whether they led you to other gods or whether or not they made predictions that weren't true. Jesus says, I'll give you an even quicker way. You'll know them by their fruits. What are they producing? What do their converts look like? What do their lives look like? That's a good. If the person is going around and he's preaching the gospel, and all of a sudden he is, because of that, multi-millionaire, living in excess and luxury and all that, you might want to be careful about that person. That fruit might indicate more something about the value they place on money than the value they place on souls. Or if someone is continually engaging in sexual sins or things like that, then guess what? You probably are seeing some fruit that you're dealing with a false teacher here. Jesus is saying you can look at the fruit that is being produced by what they say and what they do, and that's a good indication. And I think Peter's continuing that same line of thought here. He then goes on to talk about the fact that God doesn't let that stuff go unpunished, but he also opens up the door, not just to God punishing those who engage in this stuff, but God also rescues those who refuse to give into it. So he gives a couple of Old Testament examples. There's an example of angels who sinned that God has kept in bonds. There's an example of the flood where God punished the wicked world, but he did save a couple. He saved Noah and his family, saved the 8 there. And then you have Lot, and God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, but he rescued Lot and his family. And so you can go through and you can see that angels who sinned, the world sinned, and then men sinned in Sodom and Gomorrah. And what's interesting about a couple of those is you have angels sinning, and then you have men sinning in Sodom and Gomorrah, but remember, they're sinning against angels in Sodom and Gomorrah. There's a whole bunch of sins taking place in Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, there's Sodom and Gomorrah have spoken of a number of times because of the sins that they were engaged in, even things like the way they were inhospitable and mistreated people who came to visit them, and they engaged in immorality. But I think one of the big ones is God heard the cries of wickedness and he sent angels to check it out. And when the angels went to visit the city, the men tried to rape the angels. That's a big problem. Uh, that's not how you pass God's righteousness test. When he sends angels to go figure out how the city's doing, and that's how you treat them, you have failed. And so God rains down fire upon Sodom and Gomorrah, but he saves Lot. And so the point there is that even if everyone else goes after the way of these false teachers and becomes caught up in their greed, caught up in their sensuality, denying the master, guess what? God sees you. And if you haven't gone with them, God can rescue you just like Lot, just like Noah. God knows who gives in and he knows who stays true. And so that's an important reminder not to just follow the crowd. Well, the passage continues in the second half of verse 10 through the end of the chapter. And it gets into a vivid detail about the types of things that these false teachers are doing. I'm going to read it from a translation, the New Testament for Everyone. And I think it does a good job of kind of capturing the words that Peter's using, but also just written in a way that's kind of easy to understand. And it gives you a picture, a grotesque picture of what Peter sees when he looks at these false teachers. And as you read it, certainly you should think, "Oh wow, that's awful. These teachers are horrible people." That's kind of Peter's point. But I also think we shouldn't just read it as talking about them, but also have some discernment in our own lives, because the things that they fall prey to are the very same lusts that we often find within ourselves. The goal is that we've exercised self-control so that they don't get to this level. But things like greed, things like lust, I mean, all of these types of things most people battle and struggle with. But the point is, are you denying yourself for the master, or are you denying the master for yourself? And that's where the difference in the false teachers and in what we are called to be as disciples of Jesus, that's where the difference really comes in. All right, so verse 10, the second half of it, through the end of the chapter, says, "Such people are arrogant," talking about the false teachers. "They're arrogant and they're self-willed, and they are not afraid to blaspheme the glorious ones, whereas the angels, stronger and more powerful though they are, they do not bring a charge of blasphemy against them before the Lord. These people are like unreasoning animals or beasts, by nature born to be caught and destroyed. They curse at things of which they have no knowledge. They are destroyed by their own self-destructive tendencies. They commit injustice and receive injustice as their reward. They count it a pleasure to hold wild revels in the daytime. If they join for you for a meal, they pollute and stain the whole thing while they wallow in their disgusting pleasures. Their eyes are full of adultery. They cannot get enough of sin. When they find unsteady souls, they lead them astray. Their hearts have been trained in greed. They are children of the curse. They have left the straight path and have wandered off in pursuit of Balaam, son of Besor, who loved the reward of unrighteousness, who was rebuked for his disobedience when a normally speechless donkey spoke in a human voice to stop the prophet's madness in its tracks. These people are springs without water. They are patches of fog driven along by a storm. The depth of darkness has been reserved for them. They utter bombastic words of folly as they entice with licentious fleshly desires those who have only just escaped from the company of people who behave improperly. They promise them freedom, but they themselves are slaves to corruption. A person who is defeated by something, you see, is enslaved to it. For if they have fled the pollutions of the world through the knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus the Messiah, but again have become entangled in them and are defeated, they have ended up in a worse state than they were before. It would be better for them to have never known the way of righteousness than, having known it, to turn away from the holy commandment which had been given to them. There is a true proverb which now applies to them. The dog returns to its own vomit, and the sow gets washed only to wallow once more in the mud. All right, so not a beautiful picture, right? The final description is like a pig who's been cleaned off and gets back in the mud, or a dog who's vomited, walked away, and then come right back and eaten it. Those are disgusting images, and he says that's what it's like when you see these people who have known the way of truth, and they've even become followers of the Lord, but then once they start realizing the self-denial that is required in that, once they start realizing the loss of freedom, which we'll talk about in a second, once they recognize the loss of freedom to do whatever they wish, they say, I can't keep up with this. And they go back to what they think is freedom, but it's actually just enslavement to their own vices. And they turn away from the Lord, and that's the type of thing that should turn your stomach. And so you look at this and you see several things about them. One of them is they're so bold, yet they're also ignorant. And that's a dangerous combination, to be bold and ignorant. And I think you see it a lot, by the way. Whether you're talking about medical things or whether you're talking about sports sometimes. I mean, like, you see it across the board. You see people who care so much about something, they're not really educated in it, and then they have very strong opinions about it, and they're very bold even though they're pretty ignorant. In chapter 2 in verse 12, it says they revile where they have no knowledge. All right, he seems to be talking about, as we made reference earlier, there were angels who sinned and were punished, then there were men who sinned against angels, and then he says that these people, verse 10, they have corrupt desires and they despise authority. They're daring, self-willed, and they do not tremble when they revile angelic majesties, whereas angels, who are even greater than them, don't respond with blasphemy. Here's what he's saying. These people are so bold that they'll even blaspheme angels. And angels, who are even mightier than they, aren't so bold as to blaspheme them back. So that means they have kind of, in their ignorance about the angelic realm, placed themselves above angels and are now the ones who cast judgment and are now the ones who blaspheme and revile even angelic, glorious beings. That might sound weird to you because the reality is I think we have a different problem in our culture. Their culture, I think, did take angels a lot more seriously than ours does. And I believe that there's indication in the Bible that angels actually are real and they actually have authority. They have authority in the world that we live in. God didn't just create visible creatures to human eyes, but there are all kinds of beings out there that we cannot see and that we can go our whole lives and miss. You know, they're out and they're real. But God didn't just create us, and he didn't just create beings visible to our human fleshly eyes. There are other types of beings that we cannot see, and until our eyes become spiritual eyes, we'll always miss them. But here, I think, is kind of the point. There's this really cool, interesting passage in the book of Daniel where he speaks about the prince of Persia. There's this angel who's called a principality, over Persia, and he's coming, and Gabriel is trying to deliver a message to Daniel, but the angel over Persia doesn't want him to, and they actually have kind of a battle, and then Michael has to go and fight that angel so that Gabriel can escape and get his message to Daniel. And there's just a ton of interesting stuff about that passage right there. But one of the points is that it seems that there are angels who even battle about different countries and different sections of this land. When I think of authority, and this is an indictment on me, but when I think of authority, honestly, you know what I usually think of? I usually think of God and Jesus. But I also usually think of like human authorities, like local and national governments and things like that. Like, I think of the highest authority, who is God, and I think I wish people would care more about him than they care about these human authorities. But the reality is, those are generally where my mind goes. But there are other authorities also. As a matter of fact, the word like authorities and principalities and archangel, like those are words that are used by Paul to describe angelic spiritual beings also. And they're not always that distinct from the same words that would be used to describe human authorities. Because I think there's not as big of a distinction there as we sometimes think. I think there are human authorities, but angels are also involved in that process. Angels are also. And so, all of that is to say this. Their problem is that they reject and revile angelic authorities when they boast themselves up. I think our problem is perhaps we just ignore or don't even think about them. I mean, really, how often do we think about angels being real and active and having authority in our day-to-day lives? We I think tend to just kind of go on our way, and we do think about Jesus, and we do think about God, and we pray to God, and we ask for God. But I don't think that we perhaps give much thought to the fact that there is an entire spiritual world around us that we cannot see, but it's real and it's active and it's visible. Elisha got a glimpse of it when he saw the chariots of God surrounding the armies of Aram. That's a cool image, and those chariots were there the whole time, whether his eyes were open to them or not. I think that there is a real angelic world, and perhaps we don't blaspheme it. Perhaps we just ignore it. But either way, it might be a call to think more about it and to honor and respect other rulers and authorities, perhaps more than we do. But he goes on and he talks more about these false teachers, and he says things like, basically they care about their revelries during the day and their parties. Verse 14, their eyes are full of adultery. They're just looking for opportunity to sin in such ways where they, maybe literally commit adultery, or they're looking for them. They do seem to be sexually immoral, but they're just looking at ways to how they could take things that aren't theirs. They're full of, they never cease from sin. They can't get enough. They're enticing unstable souls. When they see a new young Christian, it's just prey. It's the way that a lion looks at a weak or small antelope and is thinking, that's the one I can get. That's what these teachers are doing, and I do think you see that type of thing in the church sometimes, where there are certain people who they want to have an audience and they want to have a following, and it might be hard for them to take a mature, faithful elder or something like that and put them under their wing, but you get a new Christian who's new to the faith and still has some struggles. They've just left a world of a life of worldliness or something. Maybe this is the person I can lead. Maybe this is the person who I can lead astray and get to do what I would rather them do. Maybe they're the ones who I can turn against this guy. Maybe they're the ones who I can take advantage of. And I think you have that type of attitude that can pop up. It's dangerous and it's destructive. And Peter's warning about it. But then I want you to look at verse 17. We talked about Balaam some last week, and he uses Balaam as an example. If you remember, Balaam tries to curse Israel for money, but he can't do it. And so he ends up actually encouraging that the king of Moab would use seductive women to go out there. Maybe they would entice Israel, and it works, and Israel gets punished. But he's going to try to curse them for money, and it takes a donkey starting to talk to try to discourage him from that. It's this cool passage in Numbers, but he says that's what they're like. They care more about money than they care about truth and honoring God's people. But then I want to look at his final words, verse 17 through the end. They're like springs without water. You think you see a spring, you think, okay, great, something good is going to come from here. But what actually comes isn't useful. Looks great, but then you get there and it's a disappointment. And here's what I think the disappointment is. Verse 19, they're promising something they cannot deliver. A spring without water. Promises that won't be fulfilled. They're promising freedom while they themselves are enslaved to corruption. For by what a man is overcome, by this he is enslaved. Here's the promise. They're trying to burden you with all of these rules. They're trying to burden you with their sexual immorals. They're trying to burden you by telling you to be generous and give your money away rather than store it up for yourselves. They're trying to burden you by telling you you can't look at pornography, or you can't sleep with whomever you wish, or things like that. They're just trying to burden you and bind you up. They're stealing your freedom. You can have Christ and freedom. And you start thinking, hey, that sounds kind of good, right? But the reality is that so many of the things that we think give us freedom are actually just chains that we're slapping on our wrist. Uh, Thinking you can sleep with whomever you want is freedom is a very dangerous form of slavery. It takes you and it binds you to a world that you didn't want to get into. You no longer have the self-control to remain monogamous to your wife, and you end up destroying your marriage and destroying your relationship with your kids. Did you have freedom? Sure, you have freedom. You can do what you want to do. No one's stopping you. You can go commit adultery if you want to commit adultery. You can go drink as much liquor as you want to drink. You can go gamble as much as you want to gamble. Like, sure, you have freedom to do these things. You can become like addicted to drugs if you want to. Like, there's you have the freedom to do these things, but is that really freedom? Once you are so dependent upon those drugs, are you really free anymore? When you can't get through a day without looking at pornography, or if you can't remain committed to a relationship because you're constantly chasing after other women, is that really freedom? When you've lost all of your money because you're addicted to gambling, is that really freedom? What you've done is you've exchanged self-control for slavery. Self-control is where you have freedom. Denial of self is a form of freedom because you also have the freedom to do what's right, to do what's healthy, to do what's good for you and good for others and honors the kingdom. That's not slavery. That's freedom. You have freedom to choose that. And the blessings that come from that, I believe, far outweigh the blessings that come from a fake form of freedom that says you can do whatever you want to. I, I do think that's pitched in our world, and I think it's dangerous, and I think it's destructive. Then he moves on from that, verse 20, and he describes what it's like to have the freedom that comes from Christ and to trade it for the slavery that comes from addictions to lust in the world. And he says, it's a disgusting thing for someone who has just come from the world to go right back into it again. And that's what these teachers are leading you to do. And he says, it's like a dog returning to its vomit, or a pig that was just cleaned returning to wallow in the mud. It's a sad and it's a tragic state, but I think we've seen people give into that before. And it's my hope and prayer that we won't just read this passage and think, oh, those false teachers are awful, but that we'll read this passage and look at ourselves and we'll say, perhaps I need to care more and pay more attention to angels. Perhaps I need to check where my lusts are and make sure that I exercise self-control. Perhaps I need to remember the master more than I currently do. Perhaps I need to make sure that my motives are pure, that I'm not about taking advantage of people or just always trying to get more money and more money and more money. Perhaps this passage serves not only to tell us that these false teachers were awful, perhaps it serves not only to tell us to look out for these traits in people who try to become your religious leaders and teachers, but perhaps it also can cause us to look internally and ask ourselves, what are my motives? What is my life all about right now? Who is truly guiding this ship? Because if it's you, might be you might be on a dangerous path. If it's the Lord and Master Jesus, I think you're on the right trail. To go back to our illustration from the very beginning of going on hikes, these things are how you get off of the hike. But remembering to follow the Master Jesus, that's where you see the green triangle on the tree that lets you know you're still on the right path. Stick with it. I love you, and may the love of God be with you.